Do you ever feel like you're a broken record when it comes to communicating with your dog? Is life a series of no, no, no? If you've ever found yourself trying to ignore behaviour because you're trying desperately not to reward it, but you know your dog is really struggling, this is for you. So we all know that ignoring behaviour and using verbal corrections isn't that effective. And we also know that our dogs have got needs. But we also know that we need to work from time to time rather than playing all day long, or that feeding them 17 times a day simply because they're adamant that it really is dinner time and they're going to bark at us until we get their bowl out. We know that this isn't a solution in the long term. But living with our highly motivated, smart dogs is not always an easy job. I'd like to tell you today about a dog called Nesquik, who'd found all kinds of great ways to interact with humans in his life. So Nesquik was a smart little working spaniel who got really excited when his humans returned home. He'd jump all over them, desperate to interact with them and greet them. It was like Nesquik was born with springs rather than paws. He'd caused nosebleeds, he'd bounced his way to head height, he was always punching kidneys. His humans understood that saying no meant nothing to Nesquik in those moments. In fact, it actually seemed to make his jumping worse. They'd even tried some quick fixes that people had advised over the internet, including pushing him off or even giving him a knee to the chest. Did these corrections work? They just seemed to make him even more aroused and even more anxious to greet them. So then they tried management. So first they bought a baby gate and he managed easily, as you can imagine, to jump that. So then they shut him in the kitchen. So then he just went back to jumping up the moment that the door was opened and barking from the moment that he heard the car pull up on the driveway, along with scratching at the door. So he'd ruined the kitchen door in the process. Plus one day he got his collar caught on the handle, which was pretty scary as well. So then they bought a crate and they tried teaching him to go in his crate. But Nesquik worked out really quickly how to bash his way out of the crate door when they came home. So he'd be calm in the crate all of the time, and then as soon as they came home, he was just bashing his way out. So then they brought a sturdier crate, thinking that he wouldn't be able to bash his way out of that, but he injured his tail pretty badly on that one. So worse then, he cemented that new habit of barking, and he'd just bark and bark and bark in frustration until they opened the crate door, and then they'd still get all of the jumping up all over again anyway. So they tried waiting out the barking, waiting until Nesquik was calm, but Nesquik's barking lasted longer than their nerves did, and waiting for him to calm down, well, they would have been waiting until the cows came home. It made no difference whatsoever. In fact, it just made things worse. So 200 pounds of baby gates and crates went to a new home, and luckily Nesquik didn't. But they still had no solutions. So someone advised putting a lead on him and then standing on the lead. Trying to get the lead on him when he was really excited was mission impossible, as you can imagine. So then they left a lead on him when they went out, only for that to get trapped around a chair and cause him to panic. Then he wouldn't go near his lead for weeks without a lot of tempting and fuss. And after that, it was back to the internet for his humans and trying to find some more advice of what to do with his behaviour. And a lot of people said, just ignore it, turn your back on him. So that's what they did next. As soon as they came in, they turned their back on Nesquik. Well, the good news is that the bouncing eventually stopped, and the bad news is that he just started barking at them. And when they tried to wait that out, Nesquik then started nipping their legs and grabbing at their clothes and pulling their clothes off them. So that soon escalated and he was turning to ripping clothes, and where we might have the patience to ignore jumping up, we definitely don't have that much patience when our dog is trying to tear our clothes off us. So someone then told them to mat train him to stay on the mat. So they put in 8 weeks of hard time doing that, only for him to break his sit stay the very moment that the door opened. And then somebody else suggested teaching him a sit stay at their feet for greeting, or keeping 4 paws on the floor. But Nesquik was often so aroused that he couldn't manage to do that. It was just too difficult. So Nesquik is a beautiful example of all the things that can go wrong when we're facing behaviour challenges and we're trying to find ways to help our dogs find their own healthy ways to get their needs met. If you've not had the pleasure of an irreverent romp through all things canine science and practice yet, hello there. I'm just going to make a brief pit stop just to introduce myself. I'm Emma and I work with dogs across Western Europe and in the UK. I spent 10 years in shelter work, with 6 of those years as a trustee in one of France's largest open access public shelters. And I now work on a larger remit with a number of shelters and associations across southwest France. And I run my own private practice for dogs struggling in our human world. So if you know me already, you know I live with my Belgian Malinois Liddy, who has had many of her own struggles. So former nightmare on legs, people would say that about me as well maybe, and now turned mostly dream dog. They wouldn't call me a dream dog. In many ways though, Liddy is the poster child for this webinar. So I'm a total geek about all things learning, mostly because when we get the training bit right, our dogs find it much easier to learn. And I'm all for that. We're the humans with the big brain, so let's use them. So what went wrong for Mr. Nesquik and how can we make things easier? So our first strategy when we get all of these big behaviours is usually management. Don't get me wrong, management is incredibly useful. Management like crating or baby gates, though, can be very frustrating for a dog if they aren't used to them, and that's exactly what they saw with Nesquik. It can also take time to teach our dogs to accept management like crates, the time that we might have actually spent more on training. So because management often prevents dogs from doing the behaviour that's problematic, it can also be really frustrating if the dog needs to do that behaviour, and then we find ourselves trying to help them deal with the frustration rather than the original problem. And we also know that frustration is the mother of invention. It brings out all of the best problem solving in our dogs, as Nesquik found with his barking and then the ripping the clothes off people. Often our second strategy is then correction. So that can be very tough as well because it doesn't teach the dog what we want them to do instead. And so it's often doomed to failure unless it becomes a really strong habit for them not to do whatever it is that we don't want them to do. It's not very creative either, and it doesn't give dogs strategies to get their needs met. So, like saying hi to your owners when they've been out for a while. So none of us want dogs that are just so aloof that they'll disappear as soon as we return, and as if we're intruding on their space. If we wanted that, we'd get a cat, right? So because correction only temporarily suppresses behaviour unless it becomes a very strong habit, and because it doesn't teach our dogs what to do instead, and because it never meets the dog's needs, it's very easy for less healthy, less growthful, more challenging behaviour to kind of break through, as Nesquik's guardians came to realise. But we also know we don't want to reward behaviour. So if that behaviour is all about interaction, ignoring a behaviour seems like a pretty sensible way to help it die off, so we're not rewarding it. But like corrections, ignoring behaviour doesn't teach any new behaviour, and that can be very frustrating as well. So that frustration doesn't just fertilise behaviour and cause it to intensify, it fuels inventiveness, and as we saw with Nesquik, if one thing isn't working, try something else. So this doesn't have to be a conscious decision for our dogs. Behaviour does what works. So ignoring behaviour that's being strengthened by interaction is what's known as extinction. We do it so that that behaviour will extinguish, like a candle being put out when there's no oxygen to feed its flames. One normal byproduct of not having our needs met, though, is that actually behaviour doesn't extinguish like a flame, does it? It doesn't just beautifully and neatly die out, especially if we really need something that behaviour usually gets as a result. How lovely it would be if behaviour just snuffed out like a flame. So I like to think of extinction as the kind of behaviour we see around faulty vending machines with human beings. So you're hungry, you're bored, you want food, you want drink. You can see it there behind its shiny glass looking all tempting, whatever it is in there. You grab a handful of change, you put the change into the machine, you start pressing your buttons, but your stuff gets stuck or doesn't seem to come out at all. Do you just say, "Oh well," and then walk off? If you do, go and claim your gold star right now for calm and mindful behaviour right away, because you're clearly succeeding at human being life better than me. So what do we normally do? So we normally start, if it's me, frantically pressing buttons. We increase our attempts to get stuff out, don't we? And because we're now frustrated that we haven't got what we expected, maybe we get angry or we get inventive or both. So we might push the machine, I'd kick it, or we might try and give it a wobble. Maybe we try and get our hands up through the drawer. Maybe we tap on the refund button repeatedly, hoping that at least if we don't get our snacks, we get our money back. So perhaps we see a number on the side of the vending machine, or we maybe see a website or social media accounts. Maybe we then fire off an angry phone call or email, hey, you stole my Kit Kat. We also, though, get inventive, don't we? We get persistent, and we may get angry too. Perhaps if somebody goes past and says, everything okay there? And we'd give them like a snarky, does everything look okay to you? Hopefully we don't go over and punch them for their unhelpfulness. So depending on how much we need the stuff in the vending machine, that will also affect our behaviour as well. Like if we're just a bit hungry or bored, that's not going to be very important to us. But if we're really, really hungry, then that's going to be really important to us. So the more we need it, the more motivated we are to try and get it. So if we're living in a post-apocalyptic future, scavenging through the remains of modern life, maybe if we saw a chocolate bar inside a vending machine, that might make us really motivated to get it. Maybe we get a hammer, maybe we get a paving block, and maybe we start trying to smash the machine. I mean, who knows? Given you enough time, you could very well train a little rat on a harness, you're clever, to get in through the drawer and go and retrieve you a few packs of mini cheddars or something like that. So when we really, really need something, frustration makes us persistent and it makes us creative. It's the ultimate fuel for problem solving. But instead of fading out like an oxygen-starved candle, when our behaviour is starved of the fuel that's been keeping it alive, when we don't get what we want, it has got very predictable fallout. That's inventiveness, creativity, persistence. It gets bigger, the behaviour gets more varied, it lasts longer, we change tack, we get angry. And even if it does snuff out, say I walk away from that vending machine with tears in my eyes, disappointed that my curly whirly never materialised, it means that our needs have not been met. I'm still bored, I'm still hungry. An unpredictable and unrewarding world that doesn't conform to our expectations is no good reason at all. That's a really uncertain place, and that can really contribute to anxiety as well. That was what was happening with Nesquik. So he was creative, he was inventive, he was persistent, and his guardians accidentally shaped his behaviour, because that's another thing that happens with ignoring behaviour. We often shape it so it gets much, much worse than it had been to begin with. So all of these changes were undoubtedly very confusing, both for Nesquik and for his guardians. So how can we navigate behaviour challenges more easily and more effectively rather than relying on extinction, which has got so much predictable fallout? The answer is with replacement behaviours. So for Nesquik, that actually meant teaching him some new skills, adding to his behaviours, so you've got one that really worked and always got his needs met when he wanted people to greet him, to say hello, to interact with him. So what we did was we taught him to bump people's legs with his shoulders or his hips. So you can also see that Nesquik's guardians had already tried to teach him a replacement behaviour. They'd already tried 4 feet on the floor and sit stays and mat training. They'd already tried all of these things and they'd already failed. So why did these fail, and how can we choose replacement behaviours that stick? Why did bumping their legs with his backside really work for him? If only it was just as easy as learning to stay put on a mat when people come home instead of bouncing, life will be really easy for us, and it will be really easy for our dogs as well. The first and the most important thing that we have to know is what is fueling the behaviour. A flame doesn't just run on oxygen, it also needs proper fuel, like wood, for example, something combustible. This fuel is what's strengthening and reinforcing the behaviour, it's what's keeping that flame alive. And mostly this comes down to 4 things with dogs, and these 4 things can interact. It can be all of these 4 together to varying degrees, and sometimes it can be more one than it is the other, so it varies across situations. But the first of these things is access to sensory stimulation. Let's take another behaviour that people have a lot of problems with, like pulling. So if we see our dog is really pulling a lot, and this is challenging for us, it could be fueled by access to sensory stimulation. Like our dogs get to sniff more, which is pretty ace for them. Of course, a lot of the world is about odour for dogs, so it may well be that you know a dog who has that embarrassing habit of going and sticking their nose right up into people's crotches, or worse, their bottoms. Not a topic for polite conversation, I know, but I'm sure we've all met a crotch sniffer. and hopefully a dog one, not a human one. Maybe that problem behavior is fueled by sensory stimulation that helps them make sense of the world. So you may also find that your dog may get in fights because they're always going over to unfamiliar dogs and sticking their nose right in there for a good old rummage around. Then that behavior may also be fueled by better access to odor, which helps our dogs make sense of the world. But that could also be things like tactile sensation as well. I've worked with plenty of humpers, most of them dogs, and a lot of that humping is just because it feels quite lovely. So we get all of these things. They can be visual things, they can enjoy watching things, particularly that's going to be true for collies, but they may also enjoy putting things into their mouths and the sensation of how that feels in the mouth as well. So all kinds of sensory stimulation can be fueling behavior. Another type of fuel for behaviour is what's known as tangible. So these are something physical, something that we can touch, like access to a toy or food, for example. So let's take a dog who's barking at 4:45, because clearly it's dinner time, and you are a human, are clearly a nincompoop and a simpleton who shouldn't be allowed to care for anything more complex than a stick insect, especially to a dog whose behaviour is fueled by access to these tangibles, these physical things. So my little Cocker Spaniel Tilly, she quite often bashed the water bowl around when she didn't have any water in it. So what did that bashing allow her to access? Something tangible, like water. Interactions, social behaviour, play, care, relationships, they can also fuel behaviour as well. So this was very much Nesquik's fuel. He wanted to greet the family as they all reunited after separation. One of my dogs has got this superb, in the dog's opinion, I guess, paw swipe that really always got my attention and interaction. I mean, it really worked, but it was quite painful for me. So a replacement behaviour for that would have been absolutely perfect. I didn't intend to ignore him, I just didn't really like the paw swipe. So I've worked with many dogs who use barking as a way to get their guardian's attention and hurry them along. In the last two sessions in the Border Collie Summit, you may have heard me already talking about frustration and barking. This is the place where those two presentations come together. So it's not that we want to deprive our dogs of care and interactions with us, but sometimes it would be nice if they did so in less ebullient ways. So it goes without saying that we shouldn't try to change a dog's behaviour simply because it's convenient to us. The final major fuel for behaviour that can be is that the behaviour helps the dog avoid or escape something unpleasant. So I know plenty of dogs who play, they run around the guardian when the guardian gets a lead out at the end of the walk, or when the car keys come out to go home at the end of playtime. All that kind of avoidance and running around definitely helps avoid the dog having their lead put back on or having to get back into the car. So usually these behaviours fall into a few categories, and some mean that the dogs will move further away from us, like the dog who takes our socks and really doesn't want to relinquish them. Those dogs are going to move further away if they can. But at other times, if our dogs can't move away, it can cause aggression, especially if the dog doesn't have an escape route or space to move away. So they might growl at us if they don't want us to remove their goodies, or if they don't want to be groomed or handled. And we may see that our dogs just get more fidgety, where they're in conflict over doing one thing, and it's like, oh, I'm supposed to do that, but I really don't want to. And it's usually the thing we expect them to do that's causing them the conflict, and doing another thing which is what they want to do. So we may see them trying to offer appeasement behaviours as well, like they may become more friendly with us or very fidgety if they don't want to do something or it's unpleasant for them, like they know they must but they really don't want to, and so that causes some conflict as well. So we need to identify what, and it can be a combination of things that are fueling the behaviour, because that's something that the dog needs, and we've got little hope of building up any behaviour if we don't fuel the replacement behaviour with the exact same fuel. So, for example, Amigo's big old paw swipe, that was designed to get my attention. He wasn't struggling without it, then I'd have to think of other things that we could do. But from time to time, he'd just come over for pets and cuddles just because he was something he wanted in the moment. And that could have been that he was bored or that he felt uncomfortable and just wanted to say hello. So it could also be escaping from something aversive as well. But the replacement behaviour I chose, instead of that very painful paw swipe, was actually just a chin rest. So if he wanted my attention and he wanted petting, all he had to do was come and put his chin on my lap. But if I'd tried to teach that with food or a toy, especially when I tried to swap that for the paw swipe, I'd have really had my work cut out. So he wasn't actually swiping me for a food or for a toy. So why would he give me a chin rest if he wanted an interaction? So what we're doing is we're building these replacement behaviours. We need to make sure that we're using the same incentives, the same rewards that are fueling the behaviour that we'd like to see a little bit less of. Our easiest starting point is whether the dog offers that behaviour in that context in the first place or in any context. If they do, it's already in a bag of behaviours that the dogs already know, that they already can do. And that makes it really easy to use that as a replacement behaviour. So did Amigo ever offer a chin rest on my lap if he wanted attention? Never. Did Nesquik ever offer a hip swipe for petting and attention? Sometimes, which is why we used it and why that ended up being much more effective than trying to teach him static behaviours when what he was doing was a dynamic movement. Replacement behaviours are easiest if we pick a behaviour that the dog already does in that situation. So for instance, my dog Liddy, she's the champion nose nudger stroke tea spiller. So she'll quite often come over when I'm working and stick her nose right under my arm and give it a right old nudge, usually when I've got a drink in my hand. But from time to time she comes and she'll just sit behind me and she's sort of like a little bit sad. So with these behaviours, especially if they're on cue, like I can ask Liddy for sit and she does, the things that we can prompt or we could ask for, that makes it even easier. So if I see Liddy making her way about over to me when I've got a cup of coffee in my hand and she's about to spill it, then I could say, Liddy, sit. And instead of sticking her nose in front of my under my arm, I can just use that to build the behaviour. And then I can stop prompting it whenever it becomes reliable and a strong habit. And that's exactly how Liddy learned to stop nudging me when she feels like I've been working too long and she's a little bit in need of attention. So how Nesquik learned to lean on his guardian's legs for greeting or give them a hip swipe, that was exactly the same. So we put that on cue first, we taught him to do that, and we did use some food to get that in the first place, and then we started using petting and play and interaction because that's what we knew was going to fuel it in the long run. So when there were times when Nesquik looked like he was going to jump up, then we could cue him to give the hip swipe, and I think they called it bum bump. So give the bum bump, and when he gave the bum bump, they were petting him, they were interacting with him, and yeah, he had all his 4 feet on the floor and he'd stop jumping up at them. So when our dogs have got another really strong behaviour that they offer, maybe sometimes when prompted, instead of the one that we don't want, now we can start ignoring the occasional times that they do something else. Now, I can ignore occasional nudges or claws, reminding myself, if they do that, if they offer me a paw swipe or a nudge or whatever it is, I might need to prompt them just to give me their chin or to sit at first or to give me the bum bump. I just take it as a reminder that their new habits aren't that strong yet for me not to be able to prompt it. But eventually, if I don't reward the original behaviour like the paw swipe or the jumping up or the tea nudger, then what will happen is that will die, especially if they know how to access that with the other replacement behaviour. So replacement behaviour should always allow the dog to access the same incentives as the behaviour that we're changing. We might want to use food or toys to build those behaviours separately at first, but then we should transfer them as soon as we can. So what I did with Amigo and his paw swipe, when I was teaching him a chin rest, I used some food to get that behaviour in the first place. And then my hand became the cue, so I could put my hand out and I could lower that down to my legs eventually so that he knew that he would get my attention. So I could phase out the food and use petting and interaction and all of the kind of the things that he was after, all that comfort, so that he would come over and eventually I just faded out my hand. He could put his head on my lap because he was usually sitting down when he wanted my attention, and he would get his needs met. So we should also think about whether or not the replacement behaviour is less effort than the original to get what the dog needs. So bouncing clearly took Nesquik quite a lot of energy. Leaning against his guardian's legs or giving them a bum bump was much less energy. And that meant that replacement behaviour is often more likely to be successful because it's not complicated, and that's not just adding to the challenge. So if the challenging behaviour, like the paw swipe or the jumping up, is very dynamic and it involves a lot of movement, then the replacement should also be a bit dynamic as well. So it's very hard to swap bouncing for a sit stay because it's switching from a very dynamic behaviour to a static one, and that's really hard. It was really easy though to move from a paw swipe or a nose nudge to a chin rest or a sit stay because they're much more calm behaviours, they're not as dynamic. So I like to think of it as trying to go from spin class into yoga, and it's hard to change pace like that. So when we're asking for a behaviour, it should always be less effort and less complicated than the original one was to do in the first place. And my final tip is it's also easiest for the dog if the behaviours are distinct. Where the replacement behaviours are very similar to the problem behaviour, that can cause like real confusion for our dogs. So once we've chosen a replacement behaviour that we can build up and strengthen, as long as we understand we may need to teach it in the first place if it's not already in our dog's repertoire of behaviours, and as long as we eventually building up to the same reinforcers or incentives for that behaviour, and as long as it's less effort, those three things, we should find our dog's lives much easier, especially if we're consistent, and we can make it even easier by making sure that the behaviours are very different. So for instance, a bum bump is very different in how it looks and feels from jumping up and smashing into people's noses. A chin rest is very different than a paw swipe, it's not the same kind of behaviour at all, and Liddy's sit stay is very different from nudging my arm with her nose. When we help our dogs find healthy, adaptive behaviours that help them get their needs met, that's really important. When we've got the know-how, life just gets a whole lot simpler. So thank you very much for joining me today. Don't forget to claim your free download. Thank you as ever to Sarah for organising this amazing event. It's truly a gift to have so much fantastic content available for free for everybody, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the other speakers. Enjoy the event.